count something. Yeah, I don't want to use this. So maybe I should explain before I really start that I was asked to speak on writing mathematics, and probably with the idea that I should explain how to write mathematics well. So I told Taylor that that was a bit difficult and presumptuous too. But on the other hand, I feel I'm an expert in how to write mathematics badly. So what I want to describe today is how you write mathematics badly. So maybe by taking the opposite, you might manage to do better. So let's imagine somebody who really wants to get rid of the theorem he has proved. He wants to publish it, he or she. The sexes are indifferent in this. He wants to publish it as soon as possible. He doesn't care that he's not read or understood. And he might prefer maybe not to be understood sometimes. That's all. So what does he do? Well, first he has to choose a title which doesn't give any information at all. So for instance, he can say proof of the theorem of, and then take either somebody absolutely known so that you don't know what that is, or else say a proof of theorem of Euler. I mean, the two things are essentially equivalent. They give no information. Then he has to start by stating his theorem. Well, he will call it his main theorem. Nowadays, you see, theorems are indexed by things like 2, 3, 4, and so on. So nobody will check that there is only one theorem in the paper. He can still call it the main theorem. So, and what notation he takes? Well, he takes the notations which are in his head. And he believes that every reader will know his notation. So he will say my main theorem is theorem, I don't know, an F PPH ATT is regular. I mean, and he believes that if you don't know what is AT&T and FPPH, of course, he made a misprint. You see, he wanted to write FPPF, but putting a misprint in a theorem makes it even harder to understand. As for regular, he has a good point. Regular is well defined in mathematics. It's so well defined that there are about 24 different definitions. So that's okay. So he starts with that. He might be afraid of the referee. The referee might ask him a reference for AT&T, maybe also for regular. In that case, John or whatever his name is, wait for at least 1 or 2 pages to give a reference for whatever, AT&T or FPPF. And the reference is careful. I mean, when you give a reference and you don't want the reference to be checkable, what you do is you do the following. Give a reference either to a long book, well, 600 pages is a good size, without any more reference, without pages. Well, even if you write on a theorem of Euler, you can refer to the complete works of Euler, since they have not been published yet entirely. But if you refer to SGA or EGA, you have a good chance also. But there is, speaking of references, there is something which you cannot beat, which is better than this. You refer to, so, that for the definition of ATT, CFH. And then you look in the bibliography and you find H is well, at the moment, bibliographies are really full of references of that kind, which cannot be checked by anybody, essentially. Well, okay, the name of Hilbert maybe is a little showy, but it's exactly the same if it is so and so. They should be in the bibliography. So this is the way you start. I mean, you start with not explaining the notations, and when you do explain them, making impossible references, after that, well, you have to start giving the proof. But you have many ways of making a proof difficult to follow. Well, there are some typographical things that you can do to make life a bit more difficult. I like to bring example. Let's see. We have f of x is sine x, cosine x, cosine x being continuous, and so on. So you have a dot, which plays the normal role of a dot, separating things, and you have also that dot. So really, it's nice and confusing enough. Very easy to arrange, because of course you could always insert the function. And if you want, you can put in your mind never to begin a sentence by a symbol. I mean, I used to have a typewriter which really refused to do that. I mean, that when I was typing something, if I typed something starting with F, I heard it screaming. So it's very easy to put this in your mind. So that's one thing you can do. What else can you do to make life complicated? Well, life complicated and also make life easier for you, complicated for the reader, and simpler for you. You see, bad writing is really something which is easy, as I said, for a writer, and the real job is left for the reader. So how do you manage that? Which is very close to what I would call cheating. It's not really cheating, in the sense that the mathematician normally doesn't want to cheat, but he wants to make life easy. So what can you do? Well, there are many things. One of them is rather serious. It is the following. You write your proof in the following way. You write lemma 1, or 1 point something, I mean, with the usual system, and then something rather easy. And you give a full proof. Then you do lemma 2, the same style. Then you get to lemma 3. And here you have put all the difficulties of the theorem, all the computations are all in lemma 3. Now, lemma 3, you either say, if you're mildly honest, it is a computation. But you have variants of that. You could always say it follows from the definitions. I mean, this cannot be beaten. Or any kind of thing, but there is one thing that I really recommend if you want to make life really hard for the reader, which is you state your lemma 3, and then you do just that. See, this was invented, I mean, I didn't know this symbol when I was a graduate student, but it was invented about 20 years later. It's extremely convenient for cheating. I mean, because when you put it, in the old days, you had to write something like this, so at least you had to give some idea why you were not putting the proof. But nowadays, you just type this beautiful symbol, and nobody can ask anything. So that's a way of cheating. this is just on the style, so to speak. But you have also more serious, I think of using grammar, English grammar, in a not totally honest way. Typical thing. So, and this is very frequent in papers you can find everywhere. So, there exists an isomorphism F with this and that. So that will be theorem, and you do prove there is an isomorphism, or you make some kind of proof. And immediately after that, you say, that's theorem 1, theorem 2, F is continuous or whatever. Now, what's wrong with that? You see, it is the fact that you're playing essentially with an isomorphism, the indefinite article. And here, really, if you want to write it correctly, because I started with a symbol, my typewriter would scream. So I should have said the map. And if you pretend to be precise, you say the map of theorem 1, which is absolutely meaningless. I mean, you find that in many, many papers, and it doesn't mean anything, because the first theorem says that the set of isomorphisms is not empty. You see, this is absolutely equivalent to saying isom xy not empty. And then you pretend that you have an F. That is, that you have chosen something there. Now, most of the time, it is not entirely cheating in the sense that the proof of the theorem sometimes really gives you an F. And that's the one. But then you should say the map of the proof of theorem 1. But quite often, you don't even have that. But because you have switched from the indefinite article to the definite one, you're able to say things that you have really not proved at all. And even sometimes, you can claim things which are really meaningless. I mean, you're going to say, for instance, the map F of theorem 1 coincides with the one defined by, well, let's choose the name at random, Euler, and so on. And of course, since you have not defined, well, this has occurred in many very interesting theories. In fact, sometimes you can hardly do something about that. That is, you can actually prove there is an isomorphism, but you don't get a precise one. Or sometimes, like in Langland's theory, he wants to get a bijection between representation of some type and some other. And I remember lectures where people were saying that there exists a bijection. Okay, I used to tell them, you mean these two sets of the same cardinal. Of course, they didn't mean that at all. But at the time, they were not able to tell exactly what properties of bijection. But at least you should be aware that when you state something like this, you're saying nothing more than this. Well, a worst case, I mean, that's something also. I mean, every day I receive preprints where this type of thing occurs. I mean, theorem 1, A, there exists F, B, F is something. Well, if it is at the blackboard, I usually interrupt the speaker. I like to do that. And ask him, do you mean that you can choose F in A to have property B, or do you mean that every F having property A has property B? And well, most of the time they play safe and they say, Oh, I mean, one can choose F to have properties A and B. They chicken out. This is serious and actually not easy to arrange. I mean, if instead of speaking of bad writing, I try to say something on good writing, this is not a trivial point. Because usually you make a construction, you get an F, and you want to state the properties of F. And you are in a hurry, so you state immediately theorem there exists an F. After that, you're a bit lost. See. What is probably better is to construct F first, if possible, then state F is an isomorphism, or whatever property you have in mind. And that's okay. But that needs a little patience. But of course, you could just announce it. I mean, you could make in the commentaries or in the introduction, you could say, we construct in paragraph 2 an F having these properties. But it's better to construct the animal first and then give its properties. Okay, what else can one do? Oh, well, there are various things one can do. Let's make life a bit more amusing by, can always do this, spicing things up with creative spelling. So one would have called just misspelling. And as a good example of misspelling, I think the best one is really this one. This is a very good example of misspelling, which, so it's a self-describing word. I mean, it's perfect, which comes from the idea that it is half spelling, which it is not. No. Okay, so I don't want to give you bad examples, so let's try to write it correctly. So misspellings, well, some of them are just entertaining. I mean, how often do you find it as an abbreviation of sorts for each? Well, I have noticed that it is very often non-English or non-American people who do that mistake. When you're a foreigner and you learn English, you have a tendency to learn first the bad habits of English. And putting things like that is not such a very good habit. And here it's used wrongly. But my favorite misspelling is not that one. It occurs in topology. Principle wrongly. But my favorite misspelling is not that one. It occurs in topology. Principal bundle. Pronunciation is perfect, there is no problem. And also a dictionary will tell you that this makes sense. And in a sense, well, it's rather a poetic thing. It means a principle which varies with a parameter. I mean, so that like a Möbius band, you see, when you start with a very strong principle, you make a loop, and you arrive with the opposite principle. I say, and don't believe it is rare. I mean, I looked in the famous Google before I came, and in Google give 400 examples of that. Well, to be true, Google gives also about 4,000 correct principal bundles. Well, maybe I should still write the correct principal bundle. And also one of them, which gives the principal bundle, explains that that's wrong. And he tells the guy, because it's a conversation, he tells the guy, remember, a principal bundle written that way I didn't do it. I mean, I'm just I'm copying what I found. I just copied. But unfortunately, in the sorry, in in the examples given by Google, some of them were books, where the thing was defined that way, and where they complained. Oh, there are many ways of writing things badly. The use of abbreviations also can make life complicated. I remember one for which Kodaira was not very happy. An elliptic curve with CM. With CM, and that happened in Princeton, and I must admit I was the one writing this on the blackboard. And Kodaira told me, what do you mean with complex multiplication? I said, no, it's not with complex multiplication. I put a dot, you see. So the dot means it's an abbreviation. And of course, an abbreviation can be honest. So I remember not to do it again, but except here. So be careful about abbreviations. And people have a tendency to write everything with symbols like whatever they are, used in fact in a way not compatible with the revision. But it's doesn't take very long for replacing them by for all and exist. Another thing which makes life difficult for the reader is the use of commas. Very often you find a statement of the following form. Well, if A, and A being a complicated expression, A being, I don't know, B and C complicated expressions. And then the commas, you see, are used by the writer in two different meanings. He means here, to spell it completely, if A and B are true, so is C. So that is, this comma is an and this one is hence. And you have to be careful. I mean, it's really a bad idea to make commas do work they are not paid to do. They should not do that. So if you want to say this, because there is no way, it might mean if A is true, then B and C are true. And it is a standard construction. Do I have a complete list? Certainly not, of the various things one can do. Well, sometimes symbols are used to replace verbs. That's also very disagreeable. I remember a paper in Invenciones, at the time I was an editor, where practically the main theorem was something like this. Theorem, no word in the theorem. The theorem was a formula. And the formula was a complicated expression, some value of an N function with some characters and whatnot, equals another equally complicated expression, but different, something with powers of 2i pi and things. And then this. Fortunately, I looked at the paper and understood that what he meant was the following. He meant that this complicated expression equals this one. This he knew already. This had been proved in the paper before. So the statement was entirely here. So it meant that some number is a rational number. But you had to see in the long list of symbols which one was a verb, so to speak. So that's, so please don't use, if possible, symbols for verbs. Okay, so this is about more or less the grammar of writing and what you can do with the grammar. There are more serious or more different types of, so different types. Well, I hesitate to say cheating because that's a bit strong. When you speak in a foreign language, you have a tendency to use the strong words, not the weak words. So you have to excuse me for that. Different types of, well, cheating. Now these kinds come differently in the different branches of mathematics. So one has to look at different branches. So, well, for instance, homological algebra is easy too. Well, here the usual cheating is that you claim all the diagrams are commutative, which is sometimes the case. And whenever two people have constructed two arrows with the same origin and the same extremity, they're equal. Two naturally defined arrows are equal. So for instance, you prove an isomorphism between this homologic group and that one, and then you say we recover the theorem of, say, Eilenberg-MacLane. And I remember telling that to Eilenberg, and they telling me, well, sir, you have not proved it's the same map. I still don't know, in fact. It might be the opposite. But, and as to prove actually the diagram is commutative, this is a serious question. I mean, it's not really cheating. There is no very good way in mathematics to write a proof that the diagram is commutative. Theoretically, you could say, if it is a very simple diagram like that, you could give a name to the arrows, but that's practically never done, and then just write BA equals DC or whatever it is, and prove it. But usually diagrams have more symbols than that. So I don't think the calculus of diagrams is on a very solid basis. I mean, most of the things that people do is just claiming they are commutative. Well, Bourbaki has written some chapter on homological algebra where really there is no cheating, but it's difficult to read. The trouble is that very often, if you wanted to give a name, you would end up by a long string of letters equal another one. And then your only solution would be this follows from the definition. That's, but it is, that's really one of the troubles of homological algebra. Well, you find also in homological algebra something about the spectral sequence of a map where you have a fibrin, and this makes sense. Of course, the is the problem, because that makes sense only if you refer to a specific construction. There are various constructions in the literature, and it's not clear they give the same answer. You can do that, you can see that there is a problem by asking yourself the following. Suppose you take two manifolds. You project them to compact-oriented manifolds. You choose orientations. In that case, on the E2 term, you have a well-defined invariant class in top dimension. Tensor product of here is this. So you end up with, whenever you have an orientation of U and V, you end up with an orientation of U cross V. But which one? Because there are two natural choices. So, for instance, in Le Ray spectral sequence, the basis comes first. So one writes cohomology of the basis in cohomology of the fiber, and one multiplies, one makes up products according to that. But Grothendieck, when he defines spectral sequences in the Toku paper, just said there exists a spectral sequence. So you have to look at the proof, and different people give different proofs. And I'm not at all sure that they, well, I'm practically sure of the opposite, that they give the same answer. They give isomorphic terms, but not with the same, not with an obvious arrow. So I must say that I don't have much confidence in the signs occurring in homological algebra at the moment. So that's okay, so that's homological algebra. Topology. What are the troubles of topology? Well, they are essentially those of homological algebra plus one plus pictures. In the proof, you say, oh, yes, we have this, see picture 2. Well, picture 2, you find something like this. And if you ask the author, was it important that it wriggles 3 times or 4 times? So, no, of course not. Was it important that it didn't touch? Oh, it should touch, and so on. I mean, well, there is a picture, there is a saying which says that a picture is worth what is the standard thing? Is it 1,000 or 20 or what? 1,000 explanations. Yes, it, for the author, usually the author of a picture is very happy with it. He says, oh, look, I mean, that's absolutely splendid. I understand everything. And for the reader, it takes 1,000 explanations. That's topology. Analysis. Well, the cheating in analysis usually, especially in analytic number theory, more, let's say, especially. But the first trouble I want to point out is for all analysis. You have a theorem saying let and so on f some complicated operators depending on parameters and then complicated operators A. And then the theorem says that AF is smaller than CF or whatever, where C is a constant. A beautiful word, you see. I don't think there is any place in mathematics, be it Bourbaki or anything, that a constant is defined. I mean, there is no, what is meant is a real number, strictly positive, and you call it a constant because it doesn't depend. So it's a real number not depending on some of the data. Now, very often the theorem is stated with let f. Now, when you introduce something by let, it is exactly as if you took it and you pin it to the blackboard with a nail. You See, I mean, let f is fixed. So that, a priori, in normal good mathematics, the constant could depend on f. Of course not. The author doesn't want that. So, but it doesn't say. And the constant may depend certainly on A, but on many other things. Another way of stating this, which is more correct, which is, in fact, which is correct, and which the specialists use, is to use the Vinogradov symbol. That is to write AF, the double thing, rather than F. And then to put an index, everything on which it depends, on A or whatever, or all parameters. So that's correct. On the other hand, what they do very often is also to say they have two functions, f of x, g of x. Define, let's say, for x strictly positive. And they will write f of x is O of x, O of gx. Well, normally they should say, but they don't, for x going in that direction. But even that, that's all right. But then, what does it mean exactly? It means there are two constants, not one. There are two constants, x0 and c, such that f of x is smaller than c g of x for x bigger than x0. But very often, and then practically all the time, they will speak of the constant implicit in the O notation. That makes sense only if you have made it really clear what the x0 is. And in many instances in analytic number theory, it's not at all clear. You are computing, say, the prime function. Well, okay, you will assume something like that. But in some theorems, like the Chebotarev density theorem, when you try to write explicit bounds, you find that the x0 is as difficult to choose as the constant in front. It's very important to find the x0. So that's a typical way of cheating in analytic number theory, which I think causes lots of mistakes. Well, maybe I should speak a little on the positive side. What can you do to escape those various things? I must have forgotten a lot. Maybe I had made a little list. Oh yes, oh well, that's not very serious. I mean, it's about orthography. I mean, I wanted to comment a little bit on this. But this is ugly English, but good mathematics, because it's absolutely unambiguous. It means if and only if. So I cannot say much against it, except that what you could do for yourself, since most of you work with a computer, to put on your computer an order saying every time I type IFF, you print this. So this way you'll be happy, and I will be happy too. I must say that the French are behaving as badly as the English. C est seulement C. Which fortunately the Académie des Sciences doesn't accept. I mean, if you send a compte-rendu note, we will replace it by C est seulement C. And I'm very glad to tell you that the Germans have never introduced down und nur down. So that doesn't exist. I mean, that's I don't know Russian, so I cannot tell you whether the Russians have invented something too. So let's see. This well, one of the things I forgot. Yes. Yes. I want to say something on Bourbaki. Yes, because we still have our John, our author John, who wants to write as quickly as possible. And yeah, I chose John because you could interpret it masculine or feminine. That's. But I was going to give an advice to John, because in case the referee says, "Oh my God, your proof really, with good reason, in fact, your proof is not very good." So John can always say, "Oh yes, of course it's not a Bourbaki proof." And you see, saying that it's not a Bourbaki proof usually make people agree. I remember once, if Bot is not here, no, he's not here. So that was at Oberwolfach, no, not Oberwolfach, at Bonn, at some Arbeitstagung. And there was a lecture by an old friend of mine on the work of a physicist. And at the end of the 1 hour, it was not clear to me whether he had proved something or not. So I asked, my dear, is there a proof? I mean, can one make this into a proof? Well, he told me, oh, of course not a Bourbaki proof. And then everybody laughed. So I was not very happy, but it made me think about what is the difference between a proof and a Bourbaki proof. So I can offer you the following. That a proof is something which is accepted by experts. And a Bourbaki proof is accepted by non-experts. And of course I favor the second choice. Now, to go back to how to try to write not too badly. I mean, there are some of the things I have said, some of the troubles, which are easy to escape. I mean, you can define your notations precisely. You can give references to books by giving the page number. I should still tell you something about references to books without page. I once refereed also a paper on p-adic representations or something, where the author had a nice formula at one point, and it said reference, and then I looked at the reference, it was one of my books. But fortunately, I know essentially the formula in my book. So I knew it was not there. So, so I first thought I would write and ask the proof, and then I made a counterexample. So that solves the question. The formula was wrong. So while I was thinking of that, yes. So some of the things I've said are easy to repair. Some are not. Those on diagrams commutative are serious. What I call cheating is practically impossible to escape. I mean, every proof has some kind of cheating inside it. I mean, you cannot really give a totally explicit proof. So the question is, what do you leave out? And that's not really clear. There are people who can do that, and others, well, I have another friend, fortunately I don't give names, he sent me about a year ago a proof he had made. He had solved some question, and a 2-page proof. I thought about it. Then I gave it back to him. I said the proof is wrong, but everything you have written is correct. Because, and that's very often the case, if people want to prove theorem 1, theorem, we have this. Then they give arguments, and then they stop. And they stop, and they believe that with what they have proved, that implies a theorem. But the implication, they don't detail. And that was where the mistake was. He had assumed something which is wrong. So very often, mistakes in proofs are in the non-written part, the implicit part. But writing completely explicitly is certainly not possible. For instance, there is a very disagreeable point of identifications. We have been said all the time that we identify Z with a subset of Q. We said R and so on. But what does that mean? I mean, this is absolutely not true. I mean, N is not a part of Z. If you follow, so take the following thing. Everything is a set, practically, in the Zermelo-Frankel system. So 3 is a set. What is the cardinality of 3? I'm giving that in the Bourbaki system. N in Bourbaki is the representative of the finite sets. And the representative of the set with 3 elements is just 3. So in N, cardinal of 3 is 3. With 3 is U element of N. Elements of Z are pairs of integers with the same difference. So an element of Z has cardinality Aleph 0. So this is Aleph 0. Well, I'm not very good at Aleph 0 is 3 is in Z or Q. But here you have Cauchy sequences, and so that the cardinality is the power of the continuum. Okay, what does that mean? I mean, you should not ask the question. Yeah, but on the other hand, when we explain mathematics to other people, I mean, it is not quite compatible with what we say to tell them there are questions you should not ask. So it's very disagreeable. You have to know, and I took a rather trivial example, but there are much more amusing ones. If you take Q and the adels of Q, you have a diagonal embedding, but also you have the p-adic fields which embed, and you have also embeddings. So you have a whole collection of embeddings that are not compatible with each other. So you have to know which one you have in mind. Chevalet, who was a member of Bourbaki, would have favored never to make an identification. But this is absolutely impossible. The text would be unreadable if you had to give a name to the injection of N into Z and so on. Well, here might be good to have some name. But in that case, no. So, so at the end, we have to admit that we cannot write entirely rigorously, that it is a matter of an art to know what to say and what not to say. Okay, I stop there. But I would be happy to have comments or questions because one may have very different opinions on those things. Well, for instance, there is I didn't speak of that because it's a bit too difficult, but should one explain the ideas carefully, the ideas, or give the full details, or both? My own feeling is that if you give me a proof with all the details, I can find the ideas behind. That's not very difficult. If you give me the ideas and not the details, I may get completely stuck on some details, and also I would prefer a more detailed proof on paper, because on paper, if you find it too long, you just go to the next page. But if it is too short, and if something is missing, you may spend a lot of time trying to reconstruct it. Okay, but I wanted other question than the one I asked myself. So, no? Or come on. You must know what is bad writing, I'm sure. I mean, just read any text in the library. No? Yes? Uh, I'm sure that if this happened with Bourbaki, some member of Bourbaki would tell the other one it's because you're stupid and you have not found the correct statement which would give both of them. So normally, if that happens, there really should be, because I dislike that very much. People will tell you, oh yes, I proved theorem 1, the proof of theorem 2 is similar. Well, similar. Certainly there are things to be changed. Oh, there is an expression in Latin to say that. Do you remember? No? Changing the things which should be changed. Mutatis mutandis, yes. Mutatis. Mutandis, is that correct? I'm not sure of the spelling. No, they don't look correct. E? No. No. Okay, but well, in plain English, it means changing what has to be changed. Yes. Ah. You mean in the paper? Yeah, if you can do that, it's always very useful. It belongs to the introduction usually. Some people can do that very well. I mean, there is one way of writing papers where you have a very long introduction with all the statements and no proofs, and then the rest you give the proofs. That might be clearer, except that the notation should be clear for the theorems in the introduction. Very often you find an introduction, theorem 2, 3, 1, and so on, and the notation has not been introduced. So, but you're asking about the serious question, how should one convey the ideas? Motivation. I have tendency to believe that the motivation is my own curiosity. That is, I just want to know how the things work, and then I tell you how they work. Or I tell myself how they work. Real motivation. Well, I'm not sure I really believe in motivation. Something can look very strange at first and then make sense later. Well, there are people who know how to write a very good introduction. Since Bott is not here, I can tell his name. The topologists of my generation were quite good. Milnor also writes beautifully, and Atiyah. Some topics are less easy. I don't know how you can find the motivation in the, well, motivation. I mean, it's a beautiful theorem, the theorem of Phi-Thompson. Every finite group of odd order is solvable. The proof is 250 pages long or 300. Well, the theorem itself is the motivation, but the ideas of the proof, I mean, to a non-specialist are absolutely invisible. I mean, that's, okay, anything else? Yes? For what for? You think it was better when I was young? I don't think so. I remember papers in topology in the annals, which were, I was absolutely despairing because they were not doing anything. They were making exact sequences going around, and that's all. On groups on which they knew nothing. No, I don't think, I don't want to blame it on your generation, no. Well, it's a natural tendency. I mean, the less effort, I think that's all. Maybe the computer is also for something, because it's too easy now to take a piece that you have written at some point and put it at another one, and then the notations don't agree, or you have defined. I mean, you can do many more things. When we had to type on paper and cut and glue, there was less possibility. No, but I don't think the writing is worse now. So, well, okay, then, I guess thank you. And ooh, no, but I'm so sorry that the first time my watch is giving me that trouble.
It allowed the audience to reach its maximum before you started.
No, but now